Hey everybody, and welcome back. This is the second part of my series where we're walking through Rashid Khalidi's book about Palestine and Israel, and let's just get into it. Part 2, the Holocaust. In the wake of the Balfour Declaration and the League of Nations mandate, the Jewish population of Palestine increased dramatically. By the end of the First World War, Jews made up 6% of those in Palestine. By 1926, they made up 18%. Backed by the British and by Zionist organizations, they bought up large swaths of land and established colonies throughout the country. But there's a wrinkle here. In 1926, the Jewish population in Palestine stagnated. They were around 18% of the population, and they basically stayed there until 1932, 6 years later. And if things had stayed like this, there's a chance that things could have gone very differently, that the project of Zionism would not have truly been possible. But in 1933, the Nazis rose to power in Germany, and they immediately started throwing out Jews. And because of discriminatory immigration laws in Britain, the US, and other countries, many Jews had nowhere to go but to Palestine. In 1935, 1 year, 60,000 Jews emigrated to Palestine. By 1939, the Jewish population had gone up to 30%. As Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, put it, immigration at the rate of 60,000 a year means a Jewish state in all Palestine. The project of Zionism was alive again. I want to take a break from the book here because a lot just happened, and because I think this moment describes one of the fundamental tensions in discourse surrounding Israel. On one hand, I've obviously been very critical of Israel. I've called it a settler colonial state, an oppressive regime, etc. On the other hand, the whole thing was made possible partly because of the Holocaust, one of the worst things that ever happened. Am I now blaming Jews because the Nazis were killing them? Is that the thesis of my video? No. I don't hate the 1930s Holocaust Jews. I think that would be a bit odd. But, and this is crucial, this doesn't really change anything about the history of Israel, about its status as a settler colonial state. What's more, I think it's important to recognize that the historical and moral burden of that state does not fall merely on a bunch of Jews, but also on the forces that made their actions necessary. Nazi Germany is responsible for Israel. In its lust for expansion and ethnic cleansing, it deported thousands and thousands of Jews very far away from their homes. The UK is responsible for Israel. The British did not want to accept enough Jewish refugees, but they were fine dumping them off on their colonial possession and calling it the Jewish homeland. So, yes, I understand that people have very complicated feelings about Israel, and that those feelings are, in many cases, largely because of the Nazis. As a Jew, and as someone with two grandparents who fled the Holocaust, I empathize with those feelings a lot, but perhaps unfortunately, our story cannot end there. Real conflict began in the countryside. Zionists bought up large chunks of land, and this often resulted in peasants being expelled from land they saw as their own. This created a large class of disenfranchised, resentful poor people. As Mahmoud Yazkak put it in one article, by the early 1920s, these peasants were in increasing numbers being pushed off their lands and were moving into the urban centers in search of work and a decent livelihood. Instead, most of them encountered social marginalization and often abject poverty, unable to break out of this vicious circle and crowded together in the shanty dwellings they had put up in Jaffa and Haifa. In the countryside, the British and the Zionists reported banditry from Palestinians, and in the cities, Palestinian demonstrations against the British became larger and more militant. Following the rising tide of violence between Zionists and Palestinians, there was a 6-month general Palestinian strike. The Higher Arab Committee was formed to administer the strike and represent Palestinians, and they quickly negotiated an end to the conflict with the British. And what followed was perhaps one of the most important and influential moments in Palestinian history. Lord Peel, a British politician and member of parliament, led a royal commission to investigate the unrest in Palestine. And in the end, that commission proposed that Palestine be partitioned. 17% of the country was to be cut off and made a Jewish state, and the 200,000 Arabs that were on that land were to be expelled from it. The result of this, of course, was horrible violence. The Palestinians revolted against British occupying forces, ambushed their convoys and trains, and those forces put them down brutally. I quote from Khalidi, "The British resorted to tying Palestinian prisoners to the front of armored cars and locomotives to prevent rebel attack, a tactic they had pioneered in a futile effort to crush the resistance of the Irish during their War of Independence from 1919 to 1921. Demolitions of the homes of imprisoned or executed rebels, or of presumed rebels or their relatives, was routine, another tactic borrowed from the British playbook developed in Ireland." At any rate, after 2 years of fighting, after 14 to 17% of Palestine's adult men were killed, imprisoned, wounded, or exiled, the British had managed to extinguish the uprising. Khalidi writes, "Of all the services Britain provided to the Zionist movement before 1939, perhaps the most valuable was the armed suppression of Palestinian resistance in the form of the revolt." And I think that this is a really important note because it speaks to the gravity of the Zionist project. Because the transformation of Palestine, the formation of Israel, does not merely describe an exodus of Jews fleeing genocide. No, it also describes the world's preeminent power asserting itself over one of its possessions, proposing the establishment of strange borders and policing those borders with its massive military presence. By 1939, though, things had changed, and the UK was not particularly happy with its treatment of Palestine. As the world slid into another Great War, Britain needed to have more peaceful relations in the Middle East. I quote here, "A January 1939 report to the cabinet recommending a change of course in Palestine stressed the importance of winning the confidence of Egypt and the neighboring Arab states. For this reason, Neville Chamberlain, Britain's prime minister at the time, pared back Jewish immigration to Palestine and attempted to form some kind of peace with the area. None of this lasted long, though. Neville Chamberlain was on his way out of office to be replaced by the extremely Zionist Winston Churchill. And in any case, by this point, a new global superpower was emerging, the United States, and it would rise to help the Zionist project. I hope you'll join me next time in the 1940s. Thank you for your time.